Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. This is me, Ginger from Riverside Productions. Today I am going to be breaking down a UK drill instrumental that I made a few years ago called Javelay. The song was inspired by a track by Tion called Body, which also came out a few years ago and had many other artists featuring on it. It was a great track and it inspired me to make this track that I'm going to show you today. So let's dive in and see exactly what I done. First and foremost, guys, I'm just going to play you the introduction to this track and then skip to the hook part so that you can have an idea of how it sounds. For the main part for rather most of this track, the main sound that I've got going is this here. This sound I made in a virtual instrument which I don't actually remember what it was called, but I did manipulate the sound quite a bit to get that sound that you can hear right now. It's kind of like a string pad sound, and it's sort of like swelling up per time it comes in. As you can see from the waveform here, I've reversed it, so it's got like this swell pattern. This was like the main thing for me in this track. And then I started to add the drums. So the drums in any UK drill track are usually like the foundation of it. To get that UK drill sound, you want to have certain elements going on. So first and foremost, I obviously had the main theme sound. When I start to make a UK drill track, to get that bounce going, I always like to start with the counter snare. And this is my counter snare here. It's a sample that I had. It's called Tiny Rim. So it's like this rim sound, and I quite liked it. And this is the pattern here. The next thing that I done was to add in the kick. The kick pattern is pretty basic. It's hitting like on the first beat of the bar, third beat, and then it's got a few in between, right? So already we are getting that bounce. For my actual kick drum, I've just taken out some of the lows. I've scooped a little bit here out at 150, and I've cut the highs. I actually got another kick drum sample, and this one is the top part of the kick, and that's because I felt like the sample that I had for the more beefier part of the kick was lacking that high end. So I used another sample and just layered them together, and combined, it filled out the frequencies. There we go with the counter snare as well. And with the counter snare, in terms of processing, as you can see, the sample is already pretty wide. So what I done is I widened it out a little bit more, because with the counter snare, I don't want it to be in the middle. I want to save that space for the elements such as the kick, the 808, and the main theme, the main melody. With it as well, I've cut some of the low end and taken out some of the resonances too. So there is the counter snare. Then I've got my snare, and on my snare I've got, like, if you hear, a little bit of reverb going on as well. And I'm not going to open that because at the moment I've updated my Logic, and the Valhalla seems to be crashing. My Valhalla reverb seems to be crashing the program, so I need to update that. I then layered that sound with a clap, another sound here. It's more of like a percussion sound. And then we have the hi-hats, and this hi-hat I actually got from a Cymatics pack. It's called Bullet Drill, and for me this sound, it just worked perfectly. This MIDI pattern with the elements that I have, as you can tell, I'm already starting to get that bounce. And again, for my hi-hat processing wise, I've used infected mushrooms wider just to sort of put it more to the sides, and got some EQ, cutting out a lot of the low end frequencies and just taking out some of the resonances. And then on top of that, guys, I've got like a crash going on here. I've got like an open hi-hat, and this is just some, things to fill in. So yeah, that's pretty much the drums. Pretty plain and simple, but as you'll see as we go on, it all starts to build up. So the next part was obviously the 808, and as you know, guys, like the 808 is so important when it comes to UK drill, especially to give it that low end, to give it that sound really that UK drill is about. So again, this is actually quite a simple pattern, again quite a simple pattern. And it's actually hitting mainly on the first beat of every bar and a few in between. And if I play that with the theme, the 808 is sort of changing with the main sound when those chords are changing in between. Then we'll add the drums. And what I've done as well is I've sidechained the kick drum with the 808. So because I want my kick drum to punch through, I've essentially got one of these sidechain EQs which has been triggered by my kick drum, because my kick drum is hitting around this frequency here. So I want the 808 to be moving out of the way so that they can both work well together. And also for the processing of the 808, I've cut out some of the lows here at like 30, don't really need that. I've got some expansion here going on at 150, and then I'm cutting out some of the resonance and the high end. On top of that, I've got this Studio FET style compressor with just a little bit of light compression at 3:1, just to tame the peaks a little bit, because I don't want it to be poking too much out of the mix. Attack at 5 milliseconds, release was at 77. And I also just added a gain after that, just to do like a volume match with the processing. Now, this is like where it got interesting for me. So I had my main theme, I've got like the bass going on, I've got like the drums, and it's already got that bounce. I then opened up Arcade, and I really love Output Arcade. It's a really, really good plug-in VST, especially for inspiration. Now, I wanted something more to fill up the track. So I found like this kind of sound to complement alongside the 808 pattern, and it sounds a bit like this. It's like a gritty modulating synth, and I found this in the 0 Hour pack, and this is called Iron Terror. And when I coupled this with the 808, I was like, this is the perfect match together. And I've also got another 808 Air, which is like the higher part, and I have bounced this out on a separate track because I wanted to process it slightly different, because the velocity of the higher 808s is sometimes a bit higher, or rather it pokes out in the mix, so I wanted it on a separate track. With this gritty bass sound, I've got an imager on there, because as you can see it's quite a wide sound, but I wanted to make sure that the lows contained themselves at mono, so I've put a frequency band here at 189 and dragged the stereo width all the way to -100, which essentially makes it mono. And on top of that, I've got this plugin here which is called Parallel Aggressor by Baby Audio, and what this does, it can add harmonics to a sound essentially. So if we open up Grit Bass and I open up like my span analyzer, you can see the frequencies that this sound has. And by turning on this heat, we're able to add a little bit more harmonics to the sound, which allows it to poke through the mix as we get more elements involved. And on top of that, I added like some Space Designer to this sound as well, with some reverb, and essentially that was just more for the high parts of the sound, just to give it a bit of space. So altogether, this was what my bass was sounding like. Then, the next thing I've added is this, which is essentially just a brass hit, pretty simple. It's a brass sample. And this is just highlighting some of the notes. I've cut out a lot of the low frequencies and taken away some of the resonances and the high ends. The next thing that I added was this motif. It's like a call and response. And to be honest with you guys, this is actually one of my most favorite parts of this beat. And I'm going to just highlight the sound on its own. It sounds like this. And again, this is just from a brass sample. It's got a bit of bit crusher on it, just again to help it poke through the mix. A little bit of processing with some EQ, cutting out a lot of the low frequencies and dealing with some of the resonances. And when we hear this, let's just take the other elements out for a second, right? So you can already hear like that call and response with like the hits. This brass sound is just filling the pockets in between. And then combine that with the main theme, my track was already starting to come along. So what I also done here, guys, is I added this violin sound, and this was in Nexus, ReFX Nexus 3 in fact, and this was a violin ensemble patch, and I went into effects and just made sure that I took anything that wasn't needed from this. The thing in Nexus, guys, is that their output gain is always set at like 0 dB. So whenever you're mixing a track, make sure that you check the original gain coming out of Nexus, because a lot of the time it's very loud, but in this case it worked. This was the violin sound on its own. Again, very simple sound, but all together, adding the elements, it all helped. What actually makes this track, guys, is the actual vocal sample. This sound, I got it from our Output Arcade's 0 Hour, and that was the sample there. I don't even know what he's saying, but for me it sounded like Javelay, right? And that's why I called the beat Javelay. So I added it. Love it. And in terms of the processing for that, most of the processing was actually done within the plugin itself. As you know, if you've used this VST plugin before, Output, you can sort of modify the sample, you can go into the mixer and, you know, change the effects. I kept it pretty much like it was from standard. It's got a bit of distortion on that sound, stereo delay and a limiter. And I think I added my own reverb in there as well, just so that it could suit the other elements of the track. The next sound was this choir as well, so I'll just solo this choir sound out on its own so you can hear it. Again, this was on certain elements of the track just to fill up the sound a little bit, and this was in the Dark Planet expansion, and it's called Emulator Strings. Processing, just cutting out a lot of the low frequencies and the highs, and some resonances at around 1700. As you can see, guys, when it comes to mixing, a lot of the mixing involved with the track is actually more in the sound selection and the arrangement. If your track is arranged well, meaning that elements are not all fighting at the same time, and you do call and response, you don't need to do like a whole lot of mixing and all that sort of stuff. You just need to be looking at frequencies and seeing which frequencies work well together, and, you know, cutting certain resonances out of instruments so that they don't conflict with others. At least this is what I've learned. And a good way to know, guys, if you've got a good balance on your track, by the way, is just to get like an analyzer, and I use Span. So if I just play the track all together, I can look at my frequency analyzer and see if it's balanced. In this case scenario, most of my frequencies are pretty much balanced out. But around this section, there could be a little bit more frequency, edges off on the high ends. But as you can see as well in my low end section, this is kind of where my kick drum is hitting. And, you know, my kick drum frequencies are a little bit higher than the rest of them. And that's usually quite typical in UK drill, because it's the kick drum and the 808 that is mainly driving the track. These were pretty much all of my elements involved in the track. I will show you one more sound that I really love, and this was in the pre-hook, and it's this sound here. It's like a guitar sound. Hearing that just before we get into the hook builds up that tension, and that sound was from a Contact library in Soul Sessions. The patch was called Big Hair Energy, and I think in terms of the processing, I took a lot off the processing within the actual VST itself, because, you know, a lot of times the VSTs will have a lot of processing on, which sounds great on its own, but when in a track with other elements, it can sometimes get too busy with all those different reverbs going on. So I just wanted this sound to be pretty much dry. That was pretty much all the sounds. The last thing I'm really going to show you is the arrangement. So starting from the start, we've got the introduction going on here. And for this, I've just got the main theme, the main melody playing by itself. We then go into the counter snare, so we're building up the tension here before we get into the first verse. With a one hit on the 808, and then that motif to sort of like tease the people a little bit. For the first part of the verse here, again, pretty simple, not introducing too many elements. And that's a very important thing, guys, when you're making a beat or when you're producing. You want to build up tension, you know, you want to add in certain elements so that the listener recognizes it and then take it away and then bring it back in the chorus. Going into the pre-chorus, start adding in the hi-hats with this guitar motif playing, building up the tension just before it comes into the hook, an effect sound. How I've filled up the chorus here, guys, is I've obviously added a few more elements, but they are complementing other elements that are already there. So for example, I've added this gritty bass sound to layer up with the 808. I've added these brass hits, but these elements aren't really doing too much. They are just adding to the sound that's already there. And if we look at the frequency analyzer, we can see that pretty much the whole frequency range is now filled up, and there's a good energy to the track. That's this beat that I made. Like I said, it was inspired by a UK drill track that came out a few years ago called Body, which was Tion Wayne's track, and it featured, I think, RD as well, and there was also like a remix version that was with Russ Millions and a few other artists. It was a really big track in the UK scene, and I love the sound of it, and that is where this track was inspired from. Anyway, guys, hope this video has helped you. If you want to see more beat breakdowns on this channel, then let me know down in the comment section below. Drop a thumbs up on the video, as that helps me out on the algorithm, and consider subscribing. And I'll see you in the next video from me, Ginger from Riverside Productions.